Weekend ended with another Russian ship being seized by abseiling Frenchmen. Meanwhile, Ukraine's logistics lockdown continued, leading to fuel rationing in Crimea and more Russian oil refineries self-sanctioning in a very dramatic way. No wonder Putin's finance minister has said Russia's spending on the war has gone 2 trillion rubles over budget.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in 1 day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 1st of June, 4 years and 97 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by Telegraph journalist Sophie O'Sullivan. Now, the big news in the last 24 hours is that France has boarded and seized a sanctioned Russian oil tanker in the Atlantic. During the naval operation, which was supported by Britain, heavily armed troops rappelled onto the vessel from a military helicopter 400 nautical miles off the coast of Brittany. Emmanuel Macron, the French president, wrote on social media that the mission was conducted with the support of several partners, including the UK, in strict compliance with the law of the sea. He said it is unacceptable for ships to circumvent international sanctions, violate the law of the sea, and fund the war that Russia has been waging against Ukraine for more than 4 years. Now, the Tagor, that's a crude oil tanker that has been sanctioned by the UK, the US, and the European Union, had been travelling from the Russian port of Murmansk. France's Atlantic Maritime Prefecture said this operation was aimed at checking the nationality of a vessel suspected of flying a false flag. After the inspection team boarded the vessel, an examination of the documents confirmed suspicions regarding the irregularity of the flag flown. Now, the French Navy is thought to be escorting the tanker to an anchorage for further checks after last night's operation. The Tagor is the 4th vessel seized by the French, and while the Telegraph understands a British helicopter helped track the tanker before the French eventually seized it, sources said British personnel were not involved in any further part of the mission. You'll remember, in March, Sir Keir Starmer, Britain's Prime Minister, granted the British military permission to begin boarding ships belonging to the Shadow Fleet passing through British waters. But since then, publicly available data show that dozens of sanctioned Russian vessels have passed through the Channel unchallenged. The spokesperson for the Ministry of Defence said, "We can confirm that a helicopter from onboard HMS Somerset provided tracking and monitoring in support of the French operation to board the tanker Tagor. Alongside our allies, we are stepping up our response to shadow vessels to choke off funds that fueled Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine." Now, TASS, the Russian state-owned news agency, said the French government had not informed Moscow of its intention to board the vessel, as if they would. The Kremlin said today that it considered France's seizure of the Tagor to be illegal and that it bordered on piracy. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, said he would scream and scream until he was thick. No, he didn't actually say that, but he said a load of nonsense you really don't need to care about. Now then, elsewhere over the weekend, Ukraine's mid-range strike campaign, described last week by Defence Minister Mikhailo Fedorov as logistics lockdown of Russian forces, continued over the weekend and appears to be having a greater effect than just in the south along that corridor across the top of the Sea of Azov, from Rostov in Russia through Mariupol, Melitopol and into Crimea. We've been reporting on it quite a lot recently. Now, yesterday, Ukraine's 3rd Army Corps, responsible for sectors in the northeast of Ukraine, said that they've achieved drone-enabled fire control over Luhansk City, Starobilsk, Alchevsk, Bryanka and Kadivka. They're all roughly 50 to 100 kilometres away from the front line. Now, fire control means that they don't physically hold the ground, i.e. have troops positioned on it, but can bring down accurate fire into those areas. 3rd Army Corps also say that their drones have reached the Izvanie checkpoint on the international border with Russia. That's about 50 kilometres southeast of Luhansk. Now, this campaign against Russian logistics has caused significant fuel shortages in Crimea, where the Russian-installed authorities have had to introduce fuel rationing via coupons, saying that from yesterday, municipal and social transport will be prioritised for fuel, i.e. the Ukrainian attacks are having absolutely no impact whatsoever, but if you're a civilian trying to find fuel for your car, good luck. The Institute for the Study of War, the US-based think tank, says that Sevastopol occupation governor Mikhail Razvozhev likewise said yesterday, Sunday, that fuel sales in Sevastopol had started as normal in the morning, but that sellers had sold out their allotted amount for the day within a few hours. Now, similarly, the Moscow-installed head of Russian-occupied Zaporizhia Oblast said on Saturday that there are localized and temporary logistic issues along the southern corridor. In response, Russia seems to have taken lessons from the Second World War dazzle camouflage techniques. Images are circulating online, purportedly showing that Russian forces have started painting their logistics vehicles with dazzle camouflage, thought to be in an attempt to confuse AI-assisted targeting systems used by Ukrainian drones. Now, I'm not sure this will work, as I think even with AI targeting, a human pilot has the ability to lock the drone onto the target. Plus, DazzleCam wasn't designed to stop something being seen completely. That might have been an added bonus, but it was there to confuse the human that generally was looking through a submarine periscope and searching through bad weather, so that they couldn't tell what they were looking at and in what direction and speed that thing was travelling, neither of which really helped a truck on a road in southern Ukraine. Now, to conclude this rundown of mid-range strikes over the weekend, an ammo-carrying cargo ship at Berdyansk port was also hit on Saturday night. Ukraine's 422nd Separate Unmanned Systems Regiment released footage and images showing a drone strike on a vessel moored in berth number 3 in Berdyansk. The vessel is said to be the second hit in the same dock in 2 nights, after a drone from the 412th Separate Unmanned Systems Brigade, the Nemesis Brigade, part of the Security Service of Ukraine, the SBU, had attacked another ship in the port the night before. Now then, to Russia. An overnight Saturday-Sunday, Ukrainian forces hit the Saratov oil refinery about 600 kilometers northeast of Ukraine, and the Lazarevo oil pumping station in Kirov Oblast, that's about 1,000 kilometers away from Ukraine. Rostov Oblast Governor Yuri Slusar said an oil tanker, a fuel tank, and a building in the port of Taganrog had caught fire following a Ukrainian drone strike. 2 people were said to have been injured. Explosions were also reported by residents in the city of Feodosia in occupied Crimea. The strikes were said to be part of a larger raid that targeted 23 Russian military and infrastructure sites, including an Iskander missile launcher and at least 1 Tu-142 aircraft, the Tupolev, a fleet that is particularly significant as Russia no longer manufactures the aircraft, making any losses difficult to replace. According to Major Robert Magyar-Brovdy, head of the Ukrainian Unmanned Systems Forces, drones coordinated by the newly established Centre of Deep Strike destroyed 2 Tu-142 long-range maritime patrol aircraft and an Iskander missile system. There are suggestions among the open-source intelligence community that a rare Tu-142MR communications relay aircraft used for talking to ballistic missile submarines was hit. If so, as Yaroslav Trofimov, chief foreign affairs correspondent of the Wall Street Journal, says, destroying this rare and critical component of Russia's strategic submarine capabilities represents a meaningful contribution to the security of Europe and the United States. Now, footage has also emerged over the weekend, reportedly showing Ukraine's new trailer-based attack drone launcher firing a Farpoint 1 or 2. Footage from April suggests these launchers can house 3 drones, launching them with rocket assistance. Some comments say that by using a civilian-based launcher, Russia can now attack all such trucks and other civilian vehicles. That is wrong. Under Article 51(3) of Article Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, civilians only lose their protection against attack when and for such time as they take a direct part in hostilities. So, all these civilian buses, trucks, cars and so on that Russia has been hitting when they're just going about their daily business were never targetable. And anyway, this discussion is entirely academic, as Russia has shown it routinely kills civilians regardless of international law. A country that bombs a children's cancer hospital, Okmedit on July 8, 2024, doesn't care what truck a Ukrainian drone is being launched from. Next, as La Biennale Art and Culture Festival continues in Venice, and if you haven't already done so, I suggest you listen or watch back to France's 2 reports from there that we put out on Thursday and Friday last week. They are brilliant, and I can say that because he's not here. Russian forces showed just how much they really care about culture by firebombing another church in Ukraine. Authorities said yesterday that Russian forces had destroyed the Church of the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin Mary in Zakhtine, a village in the Donbass, by dropping an incendiary device onto the church from a drone on Saturday. Now, this was not an accidental hit, even if we accept such things, but this was an incendiary device dropped specifically on that church. So while the Russian pavilion at La Biennale wishes we would all go dewy-eyed over the depth of Russian culture and the torch of intellectual Russian soul. I think we had a much more realistic expression of the Russian soul and culture in the flames of the Zakhtini church. Into Ukraine, there's not been much move on the ground over the weekend. Russia continues the so-called infiltration events, but it's only really around Konstantinivka where this seems to be having any effect at all. That's possibly because that's a feature of urban combat. That city has been under extreme pressure, as we've been reporting for weeks. Otherwise, what little change of territory there has been seems to be mostly in Ukraine's favour, especially in the area where Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk oblasts meet. But the ground we're talking about is tiny. Russian attacks continued over the weekend. Dnipropetrovsk Oblast was badly hit, and there were power outages in the north, east and south of the country. Just in the last 24 hours, 27 of 265 drones got through air defence. There were 2 waves of attacks that hit Odessa. A similar number were launched and intercepted on Saturday night, and a similar ratio, with slightly higher quantities, on Friday night. In all, 13 people were killed and over 100 injured across the country over the weekend. Now, looking a little bit wider, and on Saturday, President Zelensky thanked Germany for the donation of another new RST air defence launcher, RST being the infrared imaging system / tail thrust vector controlled. It's a short-range infrared homing air-to-air missile. He also thanked Sweden for the recent deal to get Gripen fighter jets into the hands of Ukraine's Air Force. He said, "We thank Germany for its constant contribution to protecting people. Thousands upon thousands of lives have been saved thanks to such strong support." And in a social media post, he said just last week Russia had launched more than 2,300 attack drones, over 1,500 guided aerial bombs, and more than 100 missiles of various types against Ukraine. A couple more for me. Poland has signed a record number of EU-backed defence contracts in a single day. 29 defence contracts worth nearly 19 billion euros were signed with domestic arms manufacturers under the European Union's SAFE defence loan programme. SAFE being the Security Action for Ukraine scheme, whereby 150 billion euros in low-interest loans have been made available for defence procurement. The contracts include 146 infantry fighting vehicles, 1,000 support and command vehicles for the HOMAK rocket artillery system, and equipment for self-propelled howitzers. Poland's Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz said it was absolutely the most important day in building the capabilities of the Polish armed forces. This news comes as Estonia has installed its first permanent counter-drone detection and monitoring systems along the sections of its southeastern land border with Russia, marking the beginning of a broader national surveillance network. It builds on existing infrastructure, and officials said the project reflects lessons learned from recent drone-related incidents. Estonia's Minister of the Interior, Igor Taro, said, "This is only the beginning. We are moving toward creating a network of drones that will cover all of Estonia." Now, that was a quick rattle through, quite a busy weekend. I think it's just as busy on the diplomatic front. Sophie, what have you been looking at?
Well, thanks, Tom. Speaking of drones, Volodymyr Zelensky has urged Trump to complete a drone deal with Ukraine. This drone deal would reportedly cover the potential purchase of Ukrainian drones over the next 5 years and include the possibility of jointly producing several Ukrainian drone models. In an interview with CBS program Face the Nation, Zelensky said, "We wanted to conclude the first drone deal with the United States. The US wanted to test all types of our drones. We agreed to the way they wanted to test, train with and use our systems in the air, on land and at sea. But we still don't have a bilateral drone deal, a big framework document." So in the same interview, Zelensky warned about a shortfall in missile development, calling on the US again to allow Ukrainian licenses to produce Patriot missiles, the US military's premier ground air-to-missile defense system, which can detect and intercept ballistic missiles. He warned that the shortfall in American production could spell disaster for the whole world. Zelensky said...
Not overstating it there, is he?
Well...
He's got a point, but...
Yeah, he said 60 to 65 anti-ballistic missiles per month compared to current challenges is nothing. It is no secret, and Russia knows this. We need to expand the production, said Zelensky, showing again how keen Ukraine is to be trading these military expertise in return for support from NATO countries. He also argued that a US and Ukrainian drone partnership could become one of the most powerful in the world, combining American artificial intelligence with the capabilities of Ukraine's real-life combat experience. So we'll see what happens, but Trump's yet to come back on that. So more news today that Russia's spending on the war has gone massively over budget. 2 trillion rubles worth, which is equivalent to about 28 billion US dollars. In a letter from February, which is come to light, Anton Siluanov, the Minister of Finance for Russia, warned that the spiraling overspend could still double to as much as 4 trillion rubles worth before the end of the year, and then for 2027 and 2028. In the letter, he also asked the cabinet to freeze around 2.9 trillion Russian rubles worth of non-war related planned spending for the year. Just as a reminder, Russia already allocated 40% of its 2026 budget to defense and security. So that's 16.8 trillion rubles or $238 billion. But despite that, still not enough.
Putin, they're not really known for spending lavishly on kind of roads and infrastructure and things like that, but they've taken more money out of that 2.9 trillion earmarked. Okay, fine.
To cover that, and it's
sound financial management.
Clearly, and the letter is just this more evidence that the Kremlin is coming under increasing pressure to get the spending on the war under control. In an interview on Wednesday with the Russian newspaper Kommersant, Siluanov, who wrote the letter, said, "Our reserves are not endless. We can't allow any weak points in our finances while such major transformations are going on in the world." Similarly, Renaud Suleimanov, a member of Russia's parliament, also told a Siberian news outlet last week that the war must end as soon as possible because of the economic fallout from the high military spending. He added, "Tanks and shells don't have any consumer value. They ensure employment and wages in the defense industry, but they also drive up inflation and cut other spending." Nothing from the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov yet, and alas, no information on how this is going to affect the Russian cucumber. But we have Kilner in tomorrow. So
He's in tomorrow, brilliant.
He's in tomorrow, so you can shed some light on that.
Yeah, anyone who doesn't have a clue what we're talking about, just bear with us for 24 hours. You'll understand more than you possibly ever want to know about Russian cucumber prices, but come back tomorrow.
And in other news, the naming of a Ukrainian unit has reopened some pretty bitter wounds between Poland and Ukraine. So on Wednesday, Zelensky announced that he would be changing the name of the Separate Special Operations Center North Unit to Heroes of the UPA. So the UPA, that would be named after the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the UPA, that fought in the Second World War. Now, this has really angered the Polish president, Karol Nawrocki, but why? Well, for the Ukrainians, the members of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the UPA, are military heroes who fought against the Soviets for Ukrainian independence. But in Poland, the unit is known as briefly allying with Nazi Germany against the Soviets and in turn playing a role in the Volhynia massacres against ethnic Poles in the Volhynia and Galicia regions of western Ukraine. In this massacre, 100,000 ethnic Poles were killed between 1943 and 1945, reportedly in an attempt to ensure the territory did not become part of post-war Poland. But understandably, the Poles feel very sensitive about this loss, and this has been a big diplomatic discussion for a long time. It looked like last year that perhaps they might be ready to move past it as Ukraine agreed to exhume the remains of the first victims of the massacre. But the tensions reignited when on May 19th, Kyiv repatriated the corpse of Andriy Melnik, a leader of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which was the umbrella group which established the UPA military unit. He died in 1964, but he was brought back to Ukraine for a military funeral. So what happened next? Well, the Poles are very upset by this. The Polish president has said that he would like for Zelensky to be stripped of his military Polish honor, which was given to him, the Order of the White Eagle. That was given to him in 2023 in recognition of the shared threat that Poland and Ukraine have from Putin. He's also said that Zelensky has shown that Ukraine is not ready to be part of the European family. Now, there have been conversations in the past about whether Poland would allow Ukraine to join the EU with this slightly murky past, which has not really fully been resolved yet. In contrast, Donald Tusk, Poland's Prime Minister, has admitted that Zelensky's move wounds our historical sensitivity, but warned that if we quarrel about the past, someone else will win in the future. And I think we all know who he's talking about, saying that both the Poles and the Ukrainian president should understand that before it's too late. There has been some response from Ukrainian leaders. The mayor of Lviv warned about nitpicking about the names of Ukrainian military while Ukraine is holding the largest front in Europe since the Second World War. And one of the advisors, Mikhailo Fedorov, said that Poland was now deliberately inciting conflict against the state that protects it. So this might prove to be a bit of a challenge for Ukraine and its EU admittance, as well as just fracturing this really important alliance between Poland and Ukraine itself.
I mean, why do you need to pick this fight? I mean, I know nothing about the historical precedent, but you know, I wonder why President Zelensky decided to do it now. What was the imperative? Because this is untidy. You've now got advisors to Ukraine's defence minister wading in with statements like that. That's going to get picked up and amplified elsewhere by bad actors. It's just an unnecessary spat.
I agree. Well, speaking of escalation, we now have the Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko warning that Belarus has a major target in Ukraine in its sights. This comes just days after Robert Brovdy, commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, said on May 26th that Ukrainian forces had identified 500 potential targets in Belarus. Lukashenko warned that they may have identified 500 targets, but we have one major target with precise coordinates, and it is very close to Belarus. They understand that too. So Lukashenko also dismissed the threat of a conflict with Ukraine along the northern border that's shared with Belarus, saying that the Ukrainian military does not want any war with Belarus. I know that for sure. Saying that Ukraine understands that this would mean 1,000 kilometers of additional front line, a difficult border between Belarus and Ukraine. Do they need that? No. But as we discussed last week, Belarus is becoming an increasing concern for Ukraine after performing that joint nuclear drill with Russia earlier in May. We had President Macron on the phone warning the Belarusian leader on the 24th of May against escalation of his country's involvement with the Russian war against Ukraine. And while Belarus hasn't yet directly participated in the combat operations against Ukraine, Minsk did allow Russian troops to use its territory as the staging ground for the original invasion in February 2022.
Which I think probably counts as direct participation in hostilities. Anyway, tough words there by Lukashenko. I wonder who wrote them. Yeah, it's just my thoughts. Now, today we zoom in on reconstruction efforts in Ukraine with Sturgios Aristotelis Matoulis. He's a professor of engineering at the Bartlett School of Sustainable Construction at UCL. He's involved in projects across Ukraine on all types of infrastructure, from bridges to schools and hospitals. He specialises in resilient and sustainable reconstruction efforts. He's also the founder of metainfrastructure.org and bridgeukraine.org. Here's his conversation with Adelie.
Sturgios, thank you very much for joining me in the studio today.
Thanks for inviting me.
So you are a bridge and infrastructure engineer, and you're very involved in rebuilding different things around Ukraine. The scale of destruction that I was reading about is there are at least 300 bridges that need urgent repair around Ukraine at this stage. So what is the scale of what you're working with?
Ukraine has damaged several times the GDP of the country in terms of cost. We're talking about $500 billion of US dollars in reconstruction. That includes the build development of roads, railways, schools, hospitals, houses where people live. And for bridges only, I know that there's been more than 345 bridges that have been damaged, destroyed, or are not usable anymore. This does not mean that the invaders just targeted these bridges, but it was also Ukrainians taking these bridges down to stop the advances of the Russian military. So it was a combination of, yes, targeted attacks on bridges, but also defense action.
Are you working on all 345 bridges that you've just mentioned for reconstruction? That sounds like an awful lot of work.
Yes, so we have done for the United Nations a position paper where we demonstrate what would it take to reconstruct these bridges from the perspective of costs, materials, technical challenges, etc., all the way to carbon emissions. But we have done smaller scale examples of reconstruction because the main purpose of Bridge Ukraine is not to provide the designs for these bridges. This is going to be delivered by Ukrainian designers and engineers. This is not our purpose. Our purpose is to provide all the tools, the regulations and the standards, and teach to some Ukrainian engineers on how to design these bridges. So it's more about capacity building, but also providing evidence to the Ministry of Local Communities and Territories in Ukraine on how to prioritize reconstruction. Because the order of the reconstruction and the way you put the priorities in reconstruction will actually define how quickly the country will bounce back economically, from an infrastructure point of view, as well as from a societal point of view.
So to a very lay person when it comes to engineering, can you talk me through what the process is and how long it takes?
Yes, so I'm just going to give an example. A temporary crossing can sometimes be installed quickly, okay, but a permanent, safe, resilient bridge can take months or years. And depending on security, funding, design standards, proximity of the bridge to cities and where people live makes a very different use case for each one of the bridges. Okay, so you have all these parameters in mind where you try to optimize the economy, the proximity of the people, the accessibility to hospitals and schools, but also the cost of the bridge and the availability of the material and the availability of the engineers and the designers. So taking that all into account, you try to optimize this reconstruction, right? And the government of Ukraine has very limited funds. So both the government of Ukraine, but also the external donors like the World Bank and the IMF and the European Union and the UK, they all want to see a more equitable and a more fair reconstruction in Ukraine. So that means that all these parameters that I mentioned before, economy, technicalities, etc., they all have to be taken into account. So it's not an engineer's challenge to just sit down and design and construct the bridge. It's a challenge of bringing on the same table different players, different actors, different decision makers that can actually represent the economic part of the country, the societal part of the country, the energy part of the country, because again, roads and bridges are connecting settlements with energy stations, for example. So all in all, I would say it's not about rebuilding one single asset, one single bridge. It's about understanding the context of this reconstruction from the perspective of systems, the perspective of cities.
You were just saying how Ukraine has little funds, which is an issue we report on every day on this podcast. Is that the main obstacle that you're working with in Ukraine, or is it also difficult to get engineers or resources or material? What are the different obstacles you run into?
As I mentioned before, reconstruction and resilience of a built environment, how quickly we reconstruct something after its destruction. It's not only a matter of technical approach or economic capabilities, it's about governance as well, and people play such an important role on the governance. So, a very simple example, a mayor of a city like Mykolaiv wants to reconstruct their bridges and their hospitals, and they have a limited budget that the government provided to them. But also the government has their own plans, which is a top-down approach where they try to identify what are the areas, what are the chromadas, the administrative areas in Ukraine that have to reconstruct specific infrastructure. So there is a lot of trade-off between what you do locally and what you do at the national scale. Mm-hmm. So yes, there is a challenge of people having the right engineers, in the right position, having the materials, because as you understand now, we will need hundreds and hundreds of thousands of tons of concrete and steel and timber to reconstruct Ukraine. So that's the technical part. But there is also obviously the very tight budgets, which Ukraine is now very successfully is negotiating, but also on the other hand, the governance and how people in Ukraine will, first of all, stay away from any corruption, try to streamline methods to is clear what the borderlines between local and national scale decision making is coming through.
Is that made more complicated because of the war as well?
Oh, absolutely, because Ukraine has seen a pace of destruction that no other country in the world has seen recently. Communication is key here. How do you put the people on the same table to make decisions? Ukraine is in a trajectory of doing that the right way. So, for example, there is the DREAM platform, where the Ministry of Local Territories and Communities is trying to put in place a reasonable pipeline of projects. But again, if this pipeline serves at a national scale, what does this mean locally in smaller towns, in villages, in smaller settlements? Does this actually serve these local communities that have been impacted?
Do you have examples of maybe discrepancies between what is being put in the pipeline at the national level and what actually serves the settlements and the communities locally?
Yes, I remember there was a community center that was built in a city. The local mayor very successfully managed to fund a project locally that would serve their own city. And even though the purpose of this construction had obviously a potentially very positive impact to the area, unfortunately this area was isolated because it ended up being a bit too close to the front line. And so this brand new community center has now been almost abandoned. It's being used by very, very few people that stayed in the area. And so I was very recently in a conference where ministers were discussing with mayors this trade-off between local versus national decision-making process. And I remember this was mentioned as a good example for a mayor that actually managed to get the funds to reconstruct it, whereas central government was opposing these endeavors from local decision makers.
But is it a success then if, yes, on the one hand they were able to fund it, but it's not being used by the community because no one's left?
Yeah, so it's a very clear conflict of where exactly to reconstruct. Let me give you an example about this. There is zones of the country very close to the front line that are very, very densely populated, and that's because of the displaced population. So imagine these areas are high risk because they're very close to the front line, but at the same time, the people need the infrastructure. They need hospitals, they need food. So what can you do in this occasion? Well, obviously, you cannot justify investment in these areas because it's very difficult to de-risk the reconstruction in these areas. At the same time, there is a huge need there for the people that actually live there. And so if you want to give them a future, you really need to balance this out and say, okay, I'm going to have to take the risk so I can give hope to these people there to actually stay there and not leave their country, because some of these people don't even have a house to live.
Do you build differently, and if you have that in mind, than if you're building in a safer part of the country where you're thinking, oh, this is less likely to be destroyed by a strike, and so I'm building for the long term, in comparison to this example where you're building for an immediate need that is very real, but also thinking, well, this building may not last very long?
So yes, there is dual purpose structures that we can construct. Okay, so imagine a shelter which serves as a shelter during war, but then you can easily convert it by doing some small changes and adapt it after the war, so you can convert it into a substation, an underground structure, an underground parking. There is many examples of what we call versatile structures, where you can repurpose structures so they serve a different purpose during the war and after the war. Another way to do it is to use demountable structures. So we publish, for example, papers on prefabrication and structures that can be decommissioned very quickly after the war, so you don't have additional embodied carbon, but you can justify investment now. You can quickly assemble something on site, for example, buildings and bridges, etc. But then if you realize after the war that this is a structure that I don't actually need, or I can transfer it somewhere else, you can easily dismantle and transfer and reconstruct somewhere else.
You were talking earlier about resilience science. What is resilience infrastructure, and do you rebuild differently with that in mind?
What exactly is resilience? Resilience has, let's say, two pylons. One pylon is what can you do before something happens? So, for example, before the conflict happens, before a flood happens, if we are to deal with natural disasters. What can you do on the aftermath of a war, on the aftermath of a natural disaster? So that's what we call proactive resilience, reactive resilience. So it's different ways to obviously strengthen something before you have a threat, a damage, and it's different the kind of actions, strategies, and pathways that you follow after the disaster. The fundamental idea of resilience is that we are breaking free from the traditional risk management, where the only thing you care about for risk management is how much